Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Amy pays 2 life to play a Tamiyo completed Sage while she controls Doubling Season. How many counters does Tamiyo enter the battlefield with? Alright, so I think it's probably a pretty well-known ruling that if you play a Planeswalker while you control a Doubling Season, the Doubling Season will indeed interact with that event, and you would get twice the number of starting loyalty as what you normally would with your Planeswalker. I think it's also pretty well known that if you have 2 replacement effects that both want to apply to the same event at the same time, then the affected object's controller, in this case Amy, would be the one with the opportunity to decide which order those replacement effects apply in. And so if you put both of those together, you would come up with the answer that Amy can decide to apply either the completed or the Doubling Season replacement effect first, and depending on that choice, then the Tamiyo would end up with either 6 or 8 loyalty. And that is indeed the correct answer. So if that's all you care about, then at least make sure you leave me a like and a comment so the YouTube algorithm doesn't punish me too much for putting the good content in the middle rather than making you wait until the very end. For everybody else who's interested in the explanation, buckle up, because this one is going to involve a lot of really technical, deep dive understanding into how exactly replacement effects like completed work. Ready? Let's get started. So I think this is one of those types of questions where somebody who has an intermediate or even advanced level of rules understanding might struggle a little bit more with the question than someone who has a lower level of rules understanding. And that's because there's a couple of concepts that seem like they might apply to this situation, and it turns out they actually don't. But understanding exactly why that is going to take a very detailed and very technical understanding of exactly how those concepts apply. And so the one that I'm thinking of in particular would be self-replacement effects. The conventional wisdom would be that the affected player is the one who gets to choose what order the replacement effects apply in. And that's true, but it turns out that it's not an entirely free choice. And what I mean by that is certain replacement effects have higher priority, and you would have to choose one of those types of replacement effects if it was possible to do so. And so self-replacement effects are actually the highest level of priority. So let's take a look at the definition for a self-replacement effect, and we'll try and determine whether completed might be one of these. And at first glance, it sure seems like it might, because an effect is just anything that happens in the game as a result of a resolving spell or ability. And so putting the loyalty counters onto the Tamiyo is definitely something that happens as a result of the Tamiyo spell resolving, and so it certainly would qualify as an effect under that definition. And so then we might think that, well, the completed is going to interact with that, and it's going to replace part of what the Tamiyo spell does. And so looking at it from that point of view, we could certainly see how that might be considered a self-replacement effect. However, there's actually 2 points that I'm going to bring up that contradict that view. First of all, if we notice from the definition on a self-replacement effect has to replace part of the spell's own effects. Now, a resolving Tamiyo spell, like most other types of resolving permanent spells, has a resolution that involves only one step, that being to put it onto the battlefield. And so, therefore, the thing that puts the loyalty counters on it is not actually one of the Tamiyo spell's own effects. What it actually is a modified thing that happens as a result of the Tamiyo spell effects getting modified by a replacement effect. All Planeswalkers have an intrinsic replacement effect that says that this enters the battlefield with some number of loyalty counters on it. And so that means that what we're replacing with the complete ability is actually not one of the Tamiyo spell's own effects, it's actually a modified version of the Tamiyo spell's effects. And so I can already hear some people thinking, well, wait a minute, because the rules say that all Planeswalkers have that ability. And so since we're still replacing one of the Tamiyo's abilities, then maybe we should still be considering that to be part of the Tamiyo spell's effects. And that is an interesting point. However, if you look carefully, you'll notice that the rule says that all Planeswalkers have the ability that they start with that number of loyalty counters. It does not say that a Planeswalker spell has an ability that affects how many loyalty counters it has on. And so actually the rules are only giving the ability to the Tamiyo that gives it starting loyalty after it becomes a permanent. And so therefore we really couldn't say that that is one of the effects of the spell. Certainly not one of the spell's own effects. It certainly is an effect that happens as a result of the resolving of that spell, but certainly it's not something that came from the spell itself. And so this raises another kind of an interesting question, which is that we know that replacement effects have to apply immediately before the event that they replace. And so how would it make any sense if we had a replacement effect that caused the Tamiyo to enter the battlefield with loyalty counters on it if it doesn't actually get the ability that gives it that effect until after it enters the battlefield? And that is kind of confusing, and that's another really important topic for us to understand. In order to get an answer for it, we're going to have to take a close look at the process for applying replacement effects that apply as a permanent is entering the battlefield. So as you can see here, if you have a permanent that's entering the battlefield, when the game is trying to decide which replacement effects apply and how they apply, the game is able to take a look at what that permanent would look like once it is on the battlefield. And so therefore the game is able to see that the thing that's entering the battlefield is going to have an ability that grants it a continuous effect that generates a replacement effect that says, I'm entering the battlefield with these loyalty counters on it. And so that would be how those types of effects work. It turns out that completed actually functions the exact same way. If you see the definition for completed, you can see that it's worded in such a way that implies it also is going to function as the permanent is entering the battlefield. And so therefore, it's also going to generate a continuous effect that makes there be a replacement effect that says, if I'm entering the battlefield with counters, I might enter with 2 less. Did you notice a couple of times there that I mentioned that these replacement effects actually came from continuous effects? If we bring up the definition for a self-replacement effect, you can see that that definition says in it that self-replacement effects do not come from continuous effects. And so this is the second point that I wanted to bring up that contradicts this being a replacement effect. It turns out that complete is actually a continuous effect, and so therefore it fails this test also. Now, I know that this is probably going to be kind of confusing to some people because, well, a lot of the time people only think of continuous effects as those things that layers help us out with. And yes, those are continuous effects, but it turns out there's actually other types of continuous effects too. So, for example, if you think about Trinisphere, that also has a continuous effect. And so there are other types of continuous effects that would qualify, and I'm contending that completed actually does qualify as a continuous effect. However, this one is also a really subtle point, and I had to really struggle with this one for a long time too in order to get into a spot where I felt comfortable with it. So if you take a look at the definition that the comprehensive rules gives us for continuous effects, well, you can see that it doesn't look like it's super helpful or even really that applicable here. It's not immediately obvious what the completed ability modifies out of that set of things that it says that continuous effects can modify, and it's also not really immediately obvious why we would consider this to be acting over a duration rather than just at one specific time. And so the answer to these questions is that the completed ability actually modifies the rules of the game, and it does so by making the game watch out for a specific event. And so if you've heard me talk about replacement effects and how they apply before, you've probably heard me say something that sounds sort of like, the game knows that the Tamiyo is about to enter the battlefield with some counters on it. And so therefore, it also knows that there's a replacement effect that wants to apply to this event. So if you think about that, you might want to rephrase it in your head a little bit more like, the game rules have been modified such that they're looking out for the event of Tamiyo entering the battlefield with loyalty counters on it. And the game rules have been modified such that if it sees this event about to happen, then it's going to replace it with a completely different event. And so it's completely inconsequential, the fact that this event is not going to foreseeably occur anytime else in the future because it's on a permanent that's already on the battlefield, and it's looking for that permanent to enter the battlefield. The fact that that event is probably never going to happen again does not mean that the game is going to quit looking for that event to happen. It just means that the game is looking for no reason and it's not going to be able to do anything. But it still is affecting the game rules that way. And so that would be the reason why complete is indeed going to be considered by the game rules to be a continuous effect, and therefore not a candidate for a self-replacement effect. And so there you have it. With all that in place, we can say that because complete is not a self-replacement effect, then it is possible for Amy to choose to apply it either before or after the doubling season applies. And based on that choice, the number of loyalty counters on the Tamiyo is going to end up being either 6 or 8, depending on which order she chooses for those effects to apply in. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.